Before I start my presentation, I would like to ask you all a question. Can you imagine living in a world devoid of humanity and independent thinking? I suppose all of you would dismiss this frightening thought in a heartbeat. However, this is not the case for the protagonist in the novel I'm going to share today. The book is 1984, which was written by George Orwell in 1948, and I would like to divide my presentation into three parts: the plot, the pros and cons, and its inspiration for me. Starting with the plot, it is set in 1984 in a totalitarian state called Oceania, in which the government controls the thought of its population and brings them its unthinking loyalty to its leader, the Big Brother. However, the main protagonist, Winston, has an intense longing for truth and independence, and as a result, he resents the government's oppressive control and ultimately rebels against it. Unfortunately, Winston's little rebellion does not last long and is eventually arrested for re-education, which seeks to root out his virtues. Now, being familiarized with the plot, let's delve deeper into the good points and bad points of his plot. Starting with the good points, the first good thing is that Winston's heroic pursuit of preserving humanity is being magnified by the dire consequences the book depicts. For instance, 1984 has put a huge emphasis on the effort Winston has devoted to prevent his rebellious acts from being discovered, as it will only lead to a painful death. I believe it adds a suspense and weight to all his actions, as they are done under high stakes. Furthermore, it is awe-inspiring for me to know that even though Winston has already weighed his pursuit of preserving humanity against preserving his own life, he still chooses the riskier option of preserving these virtues for mankind, and that's why he rebels in the first place. And the second point is that 1984 is not cliché-ridden in terms of plot. The book ends with evil holding triumph over good. In the end, Winston's attempt to preserve is proven futile. For example, during his re-education, he willingly betrays his love to Julia in hope of ending his suffering. For example, he shouted, "Do it to Julia, I don't care about her," in face of torture. To me, the concept of Winston's role for self-preservation overcoming his virtues, though not expected, is not entirely inconceivable. And to my dismay, this demonstrates that our virtues are not invincible, and I will elaborate further in the message plot later. Every rose has its thorns, and 1984 is no exception. I believe the ending can be misinterpreted in a pessimistic way, which discourages action. George Orwell wrote 1984 with a will to warn people about the dire consequences if totalitarianism is left unchallenged. And to achieve this, people have to be motivated to take action. However, the dystopian way the book depicts the situation makes me believe that Winston, who still carries humanity and independence in himself, is the last flicker of hope left in his world, and it will be gone forever after his death. Unfortunately, Winston's future attempt to preserve his humanity simply gives me the wrong feeling that a totalitarian government is unshakable and nothing can make a difference. And therefore, instead of prompt action that tries to salvage humanity in such a situation, isn't it giving us the wrong feeling that we should give up, as our efforts will end in vain eventually? Moving on to the message, you may ask, in absence of a totalitarian government, how does 1984 relate to us? Personally, I believe our society resembles a totalitarian government in some aspects, as both of them seek to bend individuals according to the universal beliefs endorsed by it. And this brings us to the first theme, which is how we should respond when our humanity is challenged by prevailing beliefs in the society. And to define humanity, it comprises of our aspirations and individuality. First, our aspirations should not be impeded by universal norms in society. In real life, many universal beliefs are perceived as unwritten rules in society, in which therefore society expects young people to follow suit. For example, when it comes to career planning, a survey conducted by the University of Hong Kong shows that a vast proportion of parents, around 65% of them, judge their children's career choice as they do not prioritize the salary over interest. And this is where the problem begins. In 1984, despite Winston knowing his aspiration of preserving humanity is the morally right thing to do, he still chooses to renounce it eventually to end his suffering. And similarly for young people, facing a never-ending of bombardment of judgment from society, despite knowing what they aspire for is conducive to their development, many young people resort to conforming to these beliefs to end their own suffering too. And thus this demonstrates that blindly enforcing these universal norms will have a distorting effect on individuals. And this gets me thinking, other than being and perhaps living under a totalitarian government, perhaps there's no other option for Winston but to submit. But we have no obligation to make our world a totalitarian one, and therefore, why can't we be more open-minded to our aspirations by dropping our deep-seated beliefs? And if we do not do so, the consequences will be dire. In terms of individuals, both Winston and young people appear to simply renounce something that are precious to them. But on a deeper level, this actually implies that they are willing to give up everything, including their own aspiration, morals, values, when confronting adversity. However, what about aspirations that concern morality, like aspirations for building a better world, aspirations for promoting equality and sustainability? These aspirations, like others, do lead to a bumpy road filled with obstacles and challenges posed by universal norms. However, should we fail to uphold these aspirations, then society progress will be stunted and our world will stuck in stagnation like Winston's. And in terms of society, many aspirations come into existence to address the problems associated with our society. For example, in 1984, Winston's aspiration of restoring humanity tries to address the issue of a lack of human warmth in his world. And similarly, young people's aspiration of achieving work-life balance or working as a freelancer tries to address the problem of a lack of fulfillment from the workplace. And therefore, if these aspirations are barred from execution simply because they violate some antiquated norms, then society as a whole will bear the loss of these improvements that it desperately needs. And to conclude, I believe we should not afford to lose to conform to these beliefs at the expense of our own humanity. And similarly, another equally important aspect is our own individuality. Only through appreciating the difference and uniqueness of individuals can we build an inclusive society. But the totalitarian government in 1984 goes in the opposite direction by standardizing many aspects of party members. For example, they are forced to wear the same uniform, they are forced to have the same daily routine, and they are forced to take up the same ideologies. And as a result, they are being made virtually indistinguishable, and thus uprooting their individuality. And to my horror, I have realized that our younger generation is also moving in this direction, and the aftermath can be just as catastrophic. In Hong Kong, under the influence of celebrities and advertisements, many young teens perceive the qualities possessed by their idols as standards that define perfection in one area. For example, having the appearance of a Korean pop star defines beauty, and unfortunately, this craze has slowly evolved into an obsession with making peers also conform to these standards. And facing peer pressure, I was also once tempted to shape myself according to these standards to gain recognition. But 1984 warns us that losing our individuality is dire. For example, in Winston's world, as only though it's allowed to be special, they feel insignificant and doubt the purpose. And similarly in real life, as only a handful of individuals can be considered successful by these standards, in terms of individuals, being excluded and judged inferior by these standards takes a toll on their self-esteem. And seeking to redeem themselves, many young people become eager to sacrifice their own individuality and to morph themselves according to these standards. For example, taking anesthetic surgery to make over the appearance. Then doesn't this goes against our human nature of pursuing freedom and building our own identity and individuality? And in terms of society, our society will become increasingly homogeneous as it disallows any deviation from the universal norms endorsed by it. And as a result, the once vibrant humanity, which is built on our foundation of our individuality, will be lost forever. Therefore, it is unwise to sacrifice our identity and individuality for the sake of conforming to these standards. But if we think deeper, why do we all conform to these universal beliefs in the first place? I believe the root of this problem lies in the lack of, can be attributed to a lack of critical thinking in daily life. We simply follow what we perceive without thinking, and this brings us to the second theme, which is the importance of critical thinking. I believe critical thinking is crucial in safeguarding our interests, as taking in information passively will present an opportunity for others to undermine our interpretation by controlling what facts are being presented to us. 1984 takes this to extreme. Every time when the totalitarian government fails to meet its promises, it destroys all evidence of its anti-promise, and as a result, only receiving positive information regarding the government, the population is being misled into believing the government is capable. And this demonstrates how easy our interpretation can be manipulated. And perhaps you may question the necessity of spending the extra effort in validating the information we receive. But 1984 tells us that it's worthwhile in doing so. The development in Winston's world grinds to a halt as the government is no longer obliged to fulfill any promise, and ultimately it's the population's best interest that is being sacrificed. And this tells us that blindly believing whatever other tells us equals to putting our own interests at others' disposal, and as a result, we cannot take it for granted that all the news we receive is unbiased, and everything would happen out fine for us. Take the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war as an example. All the news reports on the morality and casualty of this war are being censored on Russian state media, while only broadcasting victories after victories. And as a result, the poor Russians are misled into believing they should continue to support the invasion. With critical thinking, we'll be in a better position to sniff out the lies from the facts, and less accessible to the deceivers. And ask yourself, is it too good to be true? And therefore, it is imperative that we remain critical of all the information we receive, as in the long run, it will be us who suffer if we all get manipulated for others' gain. And to summarize, I believe our critical thinking safeguards our humanity, while our humanity drives our desire to protect our interests through critical thinking, and therefore they mutually complement each other. And to conclude, I would like to ask you all to recall the question I asked at the start. The reality is that if we don't do anything about it, this unsettling imagination will become a harsh reality. and this is why I highly recommend reading 1984, as it serves as a much needed wake-up call for us. I believe it is obvious to us when we are forced to renounce our virtues under bodily torture, but to my dismay, many of us are indifferent in ignorance of the daily choices that will ultimately cost ourselves our virtues. Perhaps you may think that we can afford to lose bits and pieces for our temporary pleasure and convenience, but one day this irreversible loss will get out of control, and one day we will pay the price wisdom paid to preserve the last bit of it. And therefore, our future hinges on actions we take today. So let's stay vigilant and protect this precious thing our protagonist Winston was able to behold before it's too late. And before I end my presentation, I would like to invite a question from the audience. Yeah.